This is a map of California and it came out in 1924. It was discovered in the drawer of Frank Vanderlip's house, old and tattered, and was photoshopped and restored to what it was many, many years ago in its original format. What about Palos Verdes? How did it come into being? What were some of the things that made it what it is today? Come with me and we'll talk to two very interesting people about California and Palos Verdes Peninsula. We're talking with Don Christie, a very important individual here in the Palos Verdes Peninsula.
You're going to talk to this camera, sorry. All right, still rolling whenever you're ready.
We're talking with Don Christie, a very important individual here on the Palos Verdes Peninsula, and his connection to the Vanderlip family. Anyone who knows anything about the peninsula knows the very important part that the Vanderlips played in the peninsula. So first of all, Don, welcome. Tell us about your connection to the Vanderlips, how that came about.
My connection to the Vanderlip family is as follows. My mother married John Vanderlip in 1972. In 1977, my stepfather, John Vanderlip, received a phone call from his brother saying that the very first house built on the hill, the cottage, 99 Vanderlip Drive, was available and would my stepdad like to move in there. And went with my stepdad, John, to go see the place and realized it needed a lot of work, but we were excited and we bought it. And we just sold the house in 2012. So it's been in the family for 35 years.
So what was it like? Share with our audience some of the memories that you have of being in that house.
Well, when we first moved there, the house needed a lot of work. It was abandoned. What was interesting is Dr. Seuss had lived in that house during the 50s. He didn't have any children, but he had a love of writing children's books.
The Dr. Seuss?
The Dr. Seuss.
Whoa!
Yes. And we moved there in 1977, fixed up the house, and we met Ellen Vanderlip, which was our neighbor. We had an interesting relationship with Ellen Vanderlip because my mother is European and Ellen is, of course, European Norwegian. And when Ellen realized that my mother was European, they got along very well. And there was a cute little thing that used to go on. Ellen used to go to the Norwegian bakery in San Pedro.
Right.
My mother, being an excellent cook, she used to make this dish called coq au vin in vol au vent.
Ah, yeah.
And Ellen used to love to come over and eat my mom's food, but she would always bring the pastries. So Ellen would bring the pastries over, my mom would make the food. Ellen always wanted to know the recipe, and my mom always wanted to know where Ellen got the pastries, but they always kept it secret from each other.
Did you get a feeling of the historical importance of the Vanderlips at that time and what they'd done and achieved?
Yes, my stepfather John was actively involved in the Historical Society, and at that time, back in 1977, his father's right-hand man, Harry Benedict, was still alive, and he would come over and they would share stories together.
How, when you heard some of those stories, did you sort of remember or think about the actual beginnings of the peninsula? I mean, how did that affect you or impact your life at that time? And indeed, how has it affected your life since then, if at all?
It affected my life because it made sense. It told me how the peninsula evolved, how these pioneers came here, how they fell in love with Portuguese men, how they wanted to build homes and live here. And being in the Historical Society, John would come home after a meeting and tell me some interesting stories. Harry Benedict would tell me some interesting stories. So I always got a sense of the history.
Did that interest you? I don't know how old you were at the time, but when you talk about the history of PV, I wonder, did you, let's show the audience this picture here. This is an amazing photograph of, well, tell us what that picture's all about.
Well, what this picture is Palos Verdes Drive North. This is Portuguese Bend Road going up behind the gates, and this is Rolling Hills Road going down. This is the Bixby Ranch where Mr. Vanderlip actually bought Palos Verdes.
But you see how completely devoid of any sort of, there's nothing there at all.
There's nothing here at all, and what makes this picture very interesting is, being the early picture it is, there's only 2 water towers. As soon as they started building more homes here, there were 3 water towers. This was before the reservoir was built.
Did you, in your growing up or with your exposure to the Vanderlips, did you get a sense of their vision? I mean, to do what the Vanderlips did took an enormous amount of vision. That there's a lot of people who think things, but then there's other people who have the vision and are then able to do it.
Well, to answer that question, I had a deep respect for Mr. Frank Vanderlip, but I always knew him when I was younger as my stepfather's father. I didn't really find his place in history until after my stepfather passed on. When my stepfather passed on in August of 2001, I cleaned out his closet and his office, and I found all these old pictures on these old maps, and that just energized my interest in the history of Palos Verdes. I realized that Mr. Frank Vanderlip had a bigger place in history than just this.
Did you say earlier on that one of the houses was abandoned?
Our house wasn't abandoned per se, but
Empty.
it was empty. What would happen were John was the youngest of the family members, and all of his family members had lived in our house at one time or another, but they didn't stay. So it was kind of like a cabin, something you would use for a little bit and then leave, but nobody really put roots into the house until we moved there in 1977.
You know, I find it interesting when you talk about cleaning out a house. When you do something like that, it's always, at least to me, intriguing, some of the stuff that you find. And I wonder, when you were cleaning it out, did you realize what you were finding?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I went with my stepfather John to many historical society meetings, and I got a feel for the history. I started learning about it, but when I saw these pictures and I saw these maps, I got excited. I said, wow, look at this. These are things that I've never seen before. And as a note, my stepfather never really took a lot of these pictures out to the Historical Society meetings. He was
Really?
Yeah, he didn't, because he was John Vanderlip, and everybody wanted to court him. Everybody wanted to talk to him, get to know him, ask him questions. So he never really brought these pictures out to light.
Wait, that's absolutely intriguing. Do you have any idea why someone like that, I mean, his connections to the Historical Society didn't do that?
They were intrigued with John and his knowledge that I guess he didn't feel the need to bring these pictures out in the limelight.
Did you ever have, and I'm sure you did you ever have, I can only call them intriguing conversations with John about all this?
Yes. I used to love to go down to the duck pond down below our home with John. That was one of his favorite places, because as a child, one of his early jobs were to feed all the birds that his father had down there at the 5 acres. There was big, large cages, there was the duck pond, there was the peacock cages, and there was a big structure down there where the men would come, and like a big locker room, and they'd put their clothes, and they'd take their clothes, and they would change their clothes, they'd take showers, and they would receive their weekly pay. And Frank Vanderlip, in many ways, had John as one of his workers. He was the young man who would take care of all of his birds.
You know, when you hear about the peninsula, when you hear about the Vanderlips, there's somehow, you mentioned the duck pond, somehow the Vanderlips and the word duck pond somehow seem connected. I mean, is that a valid comment, that the two are really connected?
Very much so. Mr. Vanderlip loved birds, and this was his hobby. So when he built his home, the area down below, he decided to make that his bird sanctuary. He had over 500 different kinds of birds. He built
How many?
500 birds.
Wow.
The peacocks were a very small part of his bird collection.
Anybody who's lived on the peninsula knows about the peacocks, and you know about the noise of the peacocks. And so when this gentleman here, Don Christie, talks about a very small percentage were peacocks, I mean, they've really exploded.
They exploded because he didn't contain them in cages. He let them run free.
All of them?
Yes. The peacocks were allowed to run free. When they came here in the cages, the cages were opened up, and they were allowed to roam free, whereas other birds, he kept them in very large cages. The duck pond was used for birds that were flying by to come and play in the water and get something to drink.
At what point in your life, it seems to me, would it be a fair question to say to you, you've made a history or a history of studying the Vanderlips?
Yes, I have. When I found all these pictures in John's closet, I
Yeah.
became fascinated. I would love to share some of these pictures with you. This is a fascinating picture because it tells a lot of history. When when Frank Vanderlip bought Palos Verdes in 1913, one of his investors was his sister, Ruth Vanderlip. And she said to him, since I'm going to be one of your investors, I want some oceanside property.
Whoa.
So she bought this whole area here, which is now the Hardin Lightman House with Portuguese Point. Now, if you take a look at this picture, you see where it's all cleared here. This is where she was going to build a large mansion right here on Portuguese Point. Because of the stock market crash in 1929, it was never built.
So you could say in a way that she was farsighted in wanting oceanfront property. And I heard recently that there was a study made very recently about real estate in California, and a lot of people apparently preferred in Palos Verdes to live up rather than live in oceanfront property. I mean, given your druthers, would you rather live in here in Palos Verdes right down by the ocean or up there?
Oh, down by the ocean.
You would?
Yes.
Because?
I like the sound of the ocean at night. I like the cool breeze. I like being just close to the ocean itself. There's something about it. I like the cliffs. I like the bumpy roads, the slide area. I like the ocean side.
When you look at your history with the Vanderlips, is the one that stands out more? I mean, when you say to yourself, the Vanderlips, ah, yes, and then instantly one name jumps to the fore, and if it does, who would that be?
Frank Vanderlip.
Because?
I respect him so much with what he did here in Palos Verdes.
How do you put that into words? I mean, when you say what he did for PV, for people who don't know about the history of PV, what do you think he did that will be, I guess, an everlasting memorial or monument to him?
Well, if you take a look at Palos Verdes and you take a look at Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, Manhattan Beach, you could tell that he loved this area. He had very strict rules on how homes were to be built. He had very strict rules about roads, about the beauty, about the layout. The early homes that he built were all Tuscan design. He had a love of beauty, and he wanted Palos Verdes not to be just another county or another city. He wanted it to be a beautiful, outstanding place, and that's the way it is now, thanks to him.
Many years ago, in fact, just before she passed away, we interviewed Ellen, and I was struck by her personality and how vibrant she was and how really tremendously excited she was to be part of the Vanderlip family. And talking to you, I sensed the same sort of, excitement about being involved with the Vanderlips. So they must have generated a lot of, really good feelings about them. But then again, having been business people, as you just indicated, they were not only very, enthralled with the peninsula, but they were also very good business people.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. Frank Vanderlip was very bright. It would be very easy to say, well, he bought Palos Verdes with 49 other investors, and that would be the extent of his life and his history. But there's a lot more. There's a lot more. And that's why I had Vicki write a book on Frank Vanderlip. I was a little too close to it, and I wanted her to write the story about his life.
Just as we close out our conversation, to think about what you just said, I'm sure it would interest people. You did say that when Frank Vanderlip made the peninsula, he had only 49 investors?
Yes.
Why do you, I don't know, is that a small number? Is it a large number? When you think about investing, somehow, to me, you think of just a couple of people, but was that a lot of people, especially way back then?
I don't know if that would be considered a lot of people. I think he had some interesting people. He had J.P. Morgan as one of his investors. That's a little known fact. He had big hopes for Palos Verdes. This was going to be almost like a Riviera here in Italian Riviera here in Southern California.
And what a terrible shame, a terrible shame that none of that came to pass, and it didn't come to pass. And I know the answer, but I want you to tell our viewers, why didn't that come to pass?
I think you want to talk to Vicki about that. Vicky is an expert on Frank Vanderlip. She wrote the book, and I think that would be a better question for
And
ask
for
her.
viewers who are watching, you say the word Vicky. Who is Vicky?
Vicky is my good dear friend and my co-writer. She helped me write Up Around the Bend, and she wrote the Frank Vanderlip book, the banker who changed the world.
So then our closing question to you is for people who want to know more about the peninsula and the Vanderlips specifically, what would you urge them to do?
Read both of our books.
Okay. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we're going to go...
In the beginning, because I don't want to get into that. Let's do this first. Yeah.
Okay, everything's rolling, John, whenever you're ready.
We're talking with a lady called Vicky Mack. Vicky Mack knows more about Frank Vanderlip and the Vanderlip family than probably anyone in California, and certainly maybe even the United States. She's written a book called Frank A. Vanderlip, the banker who changed America. For first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about this book, and what was it that got you interested in the Vanderlips in the beginning? You told me originally that you knew nothing about them.
Nothing at all. I've lived in Palos Verdes since the 60s, and it wasn't until about 2 years ago when I went to a historic homes party at Don Christie's home at the Vanderlip Cottage. And Don was telling all these wonderful tales about the history of his house and the founding of Palos Verdes. And someone in the group said, Don, you should write a book. And Don said, I've always wanted to. People keep telling me this. But he said, I have no idea how to write a book. So I don't know what to do. And like a silly little girl, I'm standing in the back with my glass of wine. And I kind of quietly raised my hand. And I said, Don, I could help you with that. And John, this has just changed my life. After Don and I wrote his book, Up Around the Bend, which I helped him put together, he said, Vicky, this is the 100th anniversary of the founding of Palos Verdes, and we need to do a book on Frank Vanderlip and the founding. And I said, I don't know if I'm really the right person. He said, no, you are. So he pushed me, and he set up interviews and brought me lunch and kept me going and gave me stories to tell, and this is the result.
I think it would be true to say that Frank Vanderlip and the Vanderlip family certainly made California, or made, I should say, sorry, but
Still rolling.
I think it's true to say that Frank Vanderlip and the Vanderlip family made Palos Verdes, and it's a very interesting story. And on the back of Vicky Mack's book, I want to just read you a short paragraph. Bank failures, home foreclosures, labor unrest, government corruption. One farm boy saw it all and rose to leadership of the country's largest bank, still creating controversy, still hotly debated today. So what was it about Vanderlip that created all this controversy?
Well, he was one of the founders of the Federal Reserve System. And if you just go online and Google the words Frank Vanderlip and Federal Reserve, you're going to get about 1,000 hits, literally, most of which talking about how it was created by bankers and this was a terrible thing and it should never have happened, and Frank Vanderlip is the devil.
So did he grow up from a wealthy family?
Oh no, he was
No.
He was born a poor boy on a farm. Well, not too poor, but he was born on a farm, and when he was 14, his father died, and the farm was repossessed. And Frank stood on the front lawn of his house and watched all his family's possessions sold off. And he and his mother and his younger sister Ruth moved into town to live with their grandmother. And Frank never really had much schooling after that point.
He had no little schooling, so it sounds to me like the classic American story.
It's
the
rags
guy
to
who
riches.
had absolutely nothing and then rose to an incredible height.
Exactly, and he did it on his own. He was obviously a very strong character. He read constantly, and I think there's a lot to be learned for us today from Frank's life. And one of those things is that anyone, through their own resources, can do what Frank did. He, ever since he was a little boy herding cows, he would put a book in his overalls to go out. As soon as he got the cows settled, he would read Shakespeare or scientific magazines.
What was it though, when you think about success and you think about people that have achieved incredible things, you look and you find that most people like that are motivated and driven. And given his beginnings, what do you, from your research in this wonderful book, what do you think motivated him to do all the things he did?
Responsibility. He always felt that he had a huge responsibility to his mother and his sister. He was, I think, driven to be around important people. I think he was looking for a father figure. And so he came to the attention of several men during his lifetime who were responsible, intelligent men of business who almost adopted him. And it brought him from the farm to being the financial editor of the Chicago Tribune, to the Assistant Secretary of State, of Treasury, I'm sorry, not State, and then to the attention of a man named James Stillman, who was president of what is now Citibank.
I think one of the key things in success is A, being motivated, and B, asking questions, and C, having connections. And if you relate asking questions and connections, he obviously had no problem in asking people, and he obviously had no problem in having connections. So all of those things, I'm sure, from what you've learned, made him what he was. Now, where was he born again? What state?
He was born in Aurora, Illinois.
And what was it that made him come to California? Did he see the land of golden opportunity out here?
Well, before he ever came to California, he was the president of the bank it was the largest bank in the country in New York. And after the bank crisis of 1907 and then the founding of the Federal Reserve, he realized that he really was not a very wealthy man. Everyone thinks of, the Vanderlip family as being so terribly wealthy.
Right.
But that really wasn't true, especially in the context of the people that he was moving around with and handling their money. So in about 1910, he started thinking, I need to be able to provide for my family. He had 6 children and a large home in New York. And so he thought, I'm going to look for some land to buy. Instead of just being in the stock market, I want something that's solid. So he looked around and he thought, I want to buy land where 2 railroads come together, because he thought those would be up and coming areas. So he bought actually 16,000 acres in Freeport, Texas. No one knows that. As part of a syndicate, and they founded the town of Freeport, which was to take shipping up the river, and there were large sulfur deposits there. So Freeport is still a town, but it's certainly nothing. It's an oil town. It's not like Palos Verdes. He bought land in Spokane, Washington, in Coos Bay, Oregon, and in Northern California. And then he still was looking around, and one day into his office in New York came a man named Carl Shader, who had taken an option on Palos Verdes. It was owned at that time by the Bixby family, and they had tried to sell it 3 times. The Bixbys were pretty good businessmen. They had this huge piece of land with a few cattle, and
Here in California?
Here in California, Palos Verdes. And there was nothing here but no trees. There were 2,000 head of cattle and about 50 Japanese farming families, and that was it.
Do you think Frank Vanderlip, when he met this gentleman, obviously he had a lot of vision. He was a visionary. Obviously, do you think that he saw the potential?
I don't think he knew what he had at that point. He certainly didn't, because he sent actually 2 of his trusted young men out here to take a look. He had never been to California. And so here he was with this opportunity. So he sent his young men before he ever actually agreed to it.
And they came out here and obviously raved about it. So he was motivated by what they said about California to come out here and see for himself. The thing that intrigues me about this wonderful book, by the way, it's called The Banker Who Changed America. Knowing the success of books can sometimes be dependent upon the name of the book and the title you give it. I'm intrigued by the title, The Banker Who Changed America. Why do you think he changed America? And why did you use that title for this book?
I used the title that I did because, first of all, building the Federal Reserve System definitely changed America. There's no question about that. He changed Palos Verdes, I think, for the better of what it would have been had he not had the vision he did. And so many other areas of the country that he helped develop in New York and Texas. He also was a very innovative thinker. He said a conservative is a person who never does anything for the first time.
What? I love that. I love that.
That was the way he thought, that he wanted to come up with new ideas. And in the world of banking, he was the first person to develop an intern program to bring young college students to work in the bank, to get them trained ahead of time. He set up schooling in the bank. He was the first person to come up with starting overseas banks that were American banks in various parts of the world. So these are all very accepted things now, but they were started by Frank Vanderlip.
I think a lot of people, when they think about Vanderlip family, think of him, and it's interesting to hear you say all these other investments and opportunities that he made throughout the United States. But when he actually purchased, it sounds funny to say when he purchased Palos Verdes, because that's a huge piece of land,
thing,
a huge
yes.
piece of land. But when he did that, I believe he had other investors. He didn't just have the money himself. He needed other help from other financial people.
That's right. He had 49 other investors. They paid $2.4 million for all of Palos Verdes.
And what year was that?
This was in 1913. And
So that was a lot of money.
well, yes, if you adjust that into today's dollars, it's over $900 million.
900 million?
Would have been, but still, that's for all of Palos Verdes. I think that's still a very fair price.
From what your research did, and by the way, this book again is absolutely fascinating. It's getting on for 450 pages. And if you want to know about California and the Vanderlip family, this is the book to read. But do you think that he realized, and his investors realized what they had?
The first time, John, that Frank Vanderlip came over the top of the hill, he was in a 1914 Packard, big Packard touring car. There were no roads, and they drove overland up the hill and up to the top of where Crest Road is now. And he looked out and was just awe-inspired. And when he wrote years later what his first thoughts were, he said, "It was an unspoiled sheet of paper to be written on with loving care." And I think that's what he tried to do, and I think to a large extent that's what we still have here, and it's a good thought 100 years later to keep in mind that we have this beauty that should never be spoiled.
But I think one of the tragic, and I use that word advisedly, I think one of the tragic facts about this whole story is that if you look at the vision that this man had and the things he wanted to do and indeed did do, the crash of 1929
Yes.
really was like a great big sledgehammer that came down. I mean, isn't it interesting to think about what might have been?
It's very interesting to think that there might have been larger homes in this area, but I want to put maybe a little different spin on talking about what happened with the crash of 1929. Before that happened, 5 years before that, there was something called the Teapot Dome scandal, which was the largest scandal up until Watergate in the government. And there were Senate investigations of a lot of government corruption. Well, Frank Vanderlip found what he thought was another piece of government corruption, and he very publicly brought it to the forefront of the American people. It turned out that what he understood was not correct, but because of his trying to bring out a lot of this corruption, he was asked to resign from many of the boards of directors he was on. And in one day, he resigned from almost 40 boards of directors. So when he did that, he was at this point retired from the bank. He was no longer in what we call the inner circle. And so he no longer had the financial background information. So when the crash came along, he lost a lot more money probably than many of his business associates actually did.
But it didn't ruin him, or did it?
Well, it didn't totally ruin him. He didn't lose Palos Verdes. He didn't lose his home. but he didn't have the financial resources behind him anymore to build his big home, to do the development he wanted. He had put a huge amount of money into the infrastructure of Palos Verdes, roads, 200,000 trees he planted, and as he did that, the tax base went up. So by 1935, he had spent pretty much out of his own pocket at this point, because most of the investors had backed out, he had spent over $1 million just in property taxes.
You know, going back to my conversation with Don Christie, and we talked about the vision of the guy and believing, to do something like that demanded an enormous amount of confidence and ability to say, I can do this, and to move ahead regardless. I mean, what an incredible individual. And just looking at your book makes me think, wouldn't you have loved to have known him personally?
Frank Vanderlip's favorite drink was a Ramos Fizz. And Frank Vanderlip's favorite place in the world to sit was on the patio, the terrace at the villa. And I've always thought that I'm so sorry that, of course, Frank Vanderlip died long before I was born, but that I would love to spend an afternoon sitting on the terrace of the villa drinking a Ramos Fizz with Frank Vanderlip.
You know, for viewers who watch this channel, we interviewed Ellen Vanderlip before she passed away. And I want to just share something with our viewers very quickly. I wanted to interview her. I called a friend of mine who gave me her phone number, and I called her and I said to her, you know, we want to come and talk to you. I said, when would be convenient to come and interview you? And she said, as quick as a flash, you better come soon because I'm going to be 90. So having said that, tell our audience, what was Ellen Vanderlip's relation to Frank Vanderlip?
Well, actually, Ellen Vanderlip never knew Frank Vanderlip, because Frank Vanderlip passed away at the age of 72 in 1937. And Ellen did not marry Frank Vanderlip's son Kelvin until the 1950s. So there was no actual relationship between the two of them. Ellen did know Frank Vanderlip's wife, Narcissa Cox Vanderlip, but the home that Ellen and her husband Kelvin lived in, which is called the Villa, was never actually lived in by anyone until Kelvin and Ellen moved in there. That was kind of a guest house. It was first a building for Frank Vanderlip's carpenters to build furniture. I shouldn't call them carpenters, furniture makers. And so when Ellen and Kelvin moved in, what you see at the villa now was really developed and beautified by her.
Just one quick thought before we close our conversation. In talking to Don Christie, we looked at an advertisement of Palos Verdes, and what an incredible advertisement it was. And you were going to point out something on that particular map. Do you remember what that was?
Yes, it was. The map that you were looking at and talking about was a map that was built in or developed in the early 30s by a gentleman named A.E. Hansen, who came to Frank Vanderlip and said, I'd like to develop part of the property, and that is what became the city of Rolling Hills. And at the time, there was nothing there at all. So Mr. Hansen thought, how am I going to interest people in coming to Palos Verdes? We have all this beauty, no one even knows it's here. So he realized that in Northern California, they had the 26-mile drive around the Carmel area. So after he built Palos Verdes Drive, north, south, east, and west, he made this map, which was I think it's 13-mile drive, and that's what you were looking at, and there were mile markers, and at each mile marker, there was a little story to tell. It was printed on the back of that map. So tourists could come, drive around, and look at the area and see that from this point you can see downtown Los Angeles, from here you can see San Pedro, from here you can see Catalina.
It's really been, at least for me, a fascinating conversation talking to you. So to leave our viewers with two things. First of all, tell me where and how they can get this book.
They can get the book at frankvanderlip.com. That is our website for all things related to Frank. And they can also get it on Amazon. Oh, also, they can also buy the book at the Interpretive Center. We're big supporters
the other thing that you should know, this is not only a fascinating book about Palos Verdes, but it also has some wonderful pictures. And if you're into history and if you like Palos Verdes, this is the kind of book that you should read. So leave our audience with a closing thought about Frank Vanderlip's legacy.
Frank said that looking back on his own life, that he had done a lot of wonderful things. He was very, very proud of what he did in Palos Verdes. And he said that, but I've often wondered in my life, everything I did, was I able to do it because I was Frank Vanderlip or because I was an American? And that in this country we have the kind of opportunity to rise from being a farm boy to the founder of a beautiful home like this.
And that's why one of the many reasons I love America. Wonderful. Thank you so much for talking.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure.
I'm standing in the doorway of the house of Vicky Mack. It was a house that was built in 1927, and the building permit was number 101. You've heard about Palos Verdes and the peninsula, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the history of this beautiful and historic place. Until next time, this is another edition of Armchair Traveler. I'm John Clayton. Thanks for watching.